Hello, everyone. I'm going to give a couple minutes to everyone to join us. Welcome to our a couple minutes before we proceed. Well, okay, we gotta start our presentation. Greetings from Boston, everyone. I'm Yelena Surilo, the Associate Director of International Engagements at the Office of Alumni Relations. On behalf of Northeastern University and myself, I hope you and your family are staying safe and healthy during this turbulent time. As I said, welcome to our program on geopolitics with Northeastern lecturer Leon Rozmarin. Let me say a few words about the presenter. Leon has been teaching courses at Northeastern since 2010. I took his class a couple of years ago as a prerequisite for the program I was doing, and I thought I would find the subject quite boring, arguing this is not my cup of tea. And I thought it would be a disaster for my grades. Gladly, I ended up enjoying it and found the subject truly fascinating. Since then, I was looking for an opportunity to bring Leon to speak to for a larger audience. Leon is originally from the Soviet Union, the city of Odessa on the Black Sea. He received his BA in history at Suffolk University, master's at the University of Chicago, where he wrote a thesis on the 18th century Russian nobility. At the end of 2010, Leon received a PhD in political science, where his dissertation addressed Russia-Chinese relationship in the context of US global presence. He argued that Russia is not balancing against China, but instead there is a long-term factors that favor their cooperation. Leon comprehensive exams were in the field of international relations, political philosophy, and Russian affairs. Before we proceed to our official program, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. Please keep your microphones on mute and video off during the program. I would like to stress that you can ask your questions in Q&A section. You also welcome to post them in a chat. I'll be monitoring your questions. That's pretty much it. So without further ado, I would like to turn the microphone to our presenter, Leon. It's the floor.
All right. Thank you very much. And thanks for everyone who's joining us in this early morning. The title of the presentation, The Striving States of the East, addresses no country in specific, no country in particular, certainly major risers, but also strivers, those that are undertaking efforts to rise, will appear, whether it's Turkey, whether it's Iran, but certainly China. But overall, to end up in this group, the so-called striving states of the East, one need not succeed every single year. One just needs to strive. Generally, this group would include, first and foremost, in my view, China, but also such states as India, Pakistan, certainly very geopolitically activated states of Iran and Turkey in a broader Middle East, a region that includes Mediterranean, as well as on one side, as well as Afghanistan on the other. But also states like Russia, Indonesia, possibly Vietnam. Not every single state needs to succeed. They just have to strive. My hypothesis is that their cumulative efforts, some successful here, some unsuccessful there, overall create a shift in geopolitical, geoeconomic, and maybe ideological global balance, their cumulative efforts. To such an extent that we are in some ways returning back to history into the 16th, 15th centuries, when the greater economic and to some extent political weight laid in the East rather than the West. So we are living in exciting times, in the time of a geopolitical or historical geopolitical shift. All right, so I will break my presentation down into 3 parts. And after each part, which should last about 10 minutes, I think, I will open the floor to various comments or questions. You could have both comments or questions. And then I will proceed with the other part. So the first part will be about some general economic tendencies. Second part will be about geopolitics. And third will be about ideology. All right. So in the 19th and early 20th centuries, Europeans branded China the sick man of Asia. And for over a century, they used to call Turkey the sick man of Europe. Well, today, however, these and other activated players from the East are better characterized as the striving states of the East, the contributors to the emerging multipolar world. As foretold by Samuel Huntington in 1993, the people and governments of non-Western civilizations no longer remain the objects of history, targets of Western colonialism, but join the West as shapers and makers of history. Similarly, in year 2000, realist scholar Kenneth Waltz predicted that the American aspirations to freeze historical development by working to keep the world unipolar are doomed. In the not very long run, Kenneth Waltz thought, this task will exceed America's economic, military, demographic, and political resources. And the very effort to maintain a hegemonic position is the surest way to undermine it. The effort to maintain dominance stimulates some countries to work to overcome it. And in his opinion, back approximately 19 years ago, multipolarity is developing before our very eyes. So he foresaw it already 20 years ago. So in terms of economic potential of these countries, in general ways, describe it as growing domestic markets, growing populations, lower labor costs, and flexible currencies. Of course, not all of these are, unqualified positives. For example, your flexible currencies could lead to severe devaluations, as has been happening in Turkey. But neither the devaluation of the lira nor even more drastic devaluation of the Iranian currency has kept these countries from, in a long term, developing and certainly from expanding their geopolitical sphere. So, as the Western societies have developed to their current level, their economic growth has stagnated, maybe even sputtered. So has the number and the welfare of the Western middle class. In contrast, in the striving states of the East, the reserve of poor but aspiring producers and consumers indicates greater potential for economic growth. Moreover, as the population growth in the rising states of the East, so does grow their domestic market. It expands, which provides increased breathing space for nascent domestic industries, whether they are national ones or whether they are foreign industries, but with local manufacturing. A flexible currency, which they all possess, essentially means the ability to weaken against the dollar. It has certain positives. It enables price competitive exports and low production costs at home. It affords some resilience for local producers. Western-made products will have and do have a more difficult time in such markets when faced with either locally made Western manufacturers or even subpar domestic alternatives, which nevertheless do satisfy local consumption associated with the good life. Some subpar but locally made electronics, furniture, cars, appliances. Furthermore, across both the West and the developing world, local producers, along, of course, with Chinese, Indian, and Vietnamese exporters, will fare better than the higher-priced Western imports. The markets of the thriving states that are growing in population and income are now being filled more and more by non-Western goods, and also by the locally assembled Western products. It's enough to say that today, first and foremost, China, but not exclusively, is not only the world's leading exporter by total numbers, by total value, but also the largest producer of such added value goods as high-speed trains, automobiles, cell phones, computers, civilian shipbuilding, and many a dozen of other products. China is now moving into the sphere of civilian nuclear reactors and airliner jets, what 15, 20 years ago it could not manufacture. Today, China is achieving a similar rapid technological rise as did Japan and South Korea in the past. But obviously, China is doing it on a much larger scale. The ambitious Make in China 2025 program aims to propel Chinese prowess further and in the process, reduce Chinese reliance on critical Western industries and technologies, which is still prime in the world today. Parallel development is the effort to spread Chinese investment and trade all across the world, specifically in Eurasia, Africa, and Latin America, to diversify away from extreme reliance on the US market. At the same time, Chinese authorities are making efforts to expand their domestic market by allowing more children per family, by further reduction of poverty and concentration on investment at home into infrastructure. It's enough to say that if we combine the population of United States, Canada, and Mexico, the former NAFTA, plus the population of the European Union, along with Great Britain, it still will be smaller than the population of China. It will be certainly wealthier, but in numbers, it will be smaller. So there's a greater potential, still greater untapped potential for Chinese domestic market development, which is a very nice, very important cushion as China attempts to go to the next, to transition onto the next economic stage and quality. So the current rise of China, first and foremost, but not exclusively, is taking place in a different geopolitical context than similar economic rises of Japan and South Korea. Both of the latter, Japan and South Korea, were, and in fact still are, under the US military and political influence and American security umbrella. Though both countries emerged as economic and technological powerhouses, they did so as junior American allies during the Cold War, with a substantial American military presence on their territory. In contrast, China is an independent geopolitical actor and is rising both in the sphere of economy and technology, but also as a political military power that aims to promote its own interests regionally and globally. No doubt, Beijing is today finding willing trade and investment partners all over the world. We're not seeing the same balancing coalition to deter and contain China across the globe as we saw in the case of Soviet Union's rise. There are some countries, no doubt, that are concerned with China's rise, certainly in East Asia. But in the Middle East, Europe, and Latin America, we are not seeing a similar Cold War alliance. Yet, while China's advance is by far the most prominent example of the historical rebalancing of the world towards the East and away from the West, it is not the only one. In East Asia, in South Asia, populous and growing economies of India, Indonesia, Pakistan, and Vietnam, and in the Middle East of Turkey and Iran, are striving to manufacture too, to win parts of their domestic markets and to export their products. Russia also has been reanimating, reactivating, rebuilding its civilian aircraft and shipbuilding industries, as well as its pharmaceutical and agricultural sector. As I mentioned, in the Middle East, Turkey and Iran are likewise striving to develop or acquire technologies for a variety of products, including in the military sphere. The cumulative effect of these efforts across Eurasia, some successful in some countries, others not, is to crowd the global market and to crowd local domestic markets, which we should always remember make up the global market. In other words, global market is made up of numerous domestic markets. So a relative victory for Chinese, Indian, or Turkish manufacturers on their domestic markets is still a victory for them on the global market. It still crowds the global market. Now, of course, this is not to claim that Western products are losing their quality or associated prestige, not at all. You know, as an example, it is difficult to imagine any automaker dislodging German cars from their pride of place. Yet the majority of the people around the world cannot afford to buy German cars. And even when they are bought used, it's expensive to maintain them. This is how competitive Japanese and subsequently South Korean automakers were able to expand globally. And it is in the same way that currently Chinese automakers are starting to do so. In other words, China is achieving what Japan and South Korea achieved in the 60s, 70s, and in the 80s and 90s. And now here comes China. Meanwhile, even German manufacturers, let's try to remember, have had to move their assembly plants into such markets as United States, China, Russia, and Mexico. In the latter, Mexico, this is where Volkswagen and more Audi cars and some, I think, Mercedeses are now assembled, among others. This is done, of course, in order to keep prices competitive and to garner a larger share of the national market. But of course, this is an example of outsourcing, and it can be applied to a myriad of Western products. In other words, manufacturing is shifting to the developing world. Certainly, the rising developing economies also compete with each other as well. Perhaps they compete with each other even more so than with the more advanced and prestigious products of the West. However, as in the sphere of geopolitics, objectively, this trend still infringes on Western economic positions. Non-Western products or locally assembled Western products are garnering greater and greater share of the domestic markets in the thriving states of the East. Meanwhile, even imports, global imports, more and more of these are made up by Chinese and other Eastern producers. China, by the way, being the leading exporter by value in dollars. So we don't know whether the economic and political rise of the non-West will surpass the West. I'm not arguing that it will surpass the West, or whether it will fall short. The process, however, is making the world market and world geopolitics more crowded and therefore reduces the share of the West, contributing to economic stagnation and social discomfort in the developed Euro-Atlantic community. Put differently, if we can optimistically envision that 20 years from now, the combined West, United States, Canada, European Union, the combined West will still remain the largest economic entity and the largest exporter and the maker of the best quality products. But we can also admit that it will make up a smaller share globally than it does today. Then we admit that it will be in a relative decline. In other words, it can remain number one, but have a smaller share of world economic power and of surplus value. Furthermore, currently the striving states of the East are driven by the demands of economic competition and military security to undertake joint ventures with other developing countries. Though no doubt they have preferred Western partners, this is not always forthcoming. Or when this does take place, it sometimes is stopped by political concerns, sanctions, or by concerns with economic competition. In the search for technology partners, therefore, the striving states of the East inevitably are forced to find each other. For example, China, for several decades, did not produce high-speed trains, but manufactured licensed copies with the help of Japanese, Korean, and European manufacturers. But today, China is the largest manufacturer of high-speed trains. It's now competing with Germany's world-renowned Siemens company for a contract, multi-billion-dollar contract, to build and equip Russia's first high-speed rail. So what used to be the monopoly of Western technologies is now being pushed by Chinese technologies. Furthermore, China has begun to manufacture its own civilian aircraft. However, because they are powered by Western engines, China is now actively seeking to close the gap. It has begun a joint project, therefore, with another striving state of the East, Russia, for a joint long-range civilian airliner. If you guys want to check it out, it's called CR929, CR929, China-Russia 929. This joint project will be powered by newest Russian jet engines, thereby combining Russian technology with much larger Chinese finance, Chinese market, and China's greater production capacity. So in this case, both needy states are joining together to pull this project. No doubt, again, the Western Airbus and Boeing duopoly will remain dominant across the globe for the foreseeable future. Yet it is also likely that during this period, the next 20 to 25 years, the Russian airliner, the so-called MS-21, and the larger Chinese-Russian CR929 will win a part of the global and of their domestic markets that are currently occupied by Airbus and Boeing. In other words, even if they win domestic markets, they win a part of the global market. Another example of the striving states of the East finding each other and cooperating is the case of the Chinese jet fighter, military jet fighter, known as the JF-17, also known as the FC-1. It's actually a very nice microcosm, a very nice example. It's manufactured in China, it's exported to Pakistan, another striving state of the East. So it is powered by a Russian jet engine, it's equipped with a Chinese radar, And in part, it is manufactured and assembled in Pakistan itself. So we have this triumvirate, these three countries joining together to manufacture a jet fighter. Similar forms of cooperation are certainly possible in the near future between these countries and other striving states, be it Iran, India, or even NATO member Turkey, which is actively seeking to develop independent domestic military systems. And Turkey has been recently denied, this has been happening in 2019, 2020, very recent. Turkey has been denied access to Western technologies, to technologies from partner NATO states in the drone or UAV, tank engines and transmissions, as well as helicopter engines and transmissions, and self-propelled guns, engines and transmissions. Austrian, Canadian, British, and German engine manufacturers are now denying Turkey access to technologies that Turkey previously had. What is Turkey to do? Go out and seek Chinese, Russian, and recently, by the way, Ukrainian substitutes. So likewise with a wider number of other manufacturers and services. To sum it up, developing countries will aim to gain a larger share of their domestic markets with their own less expensive products or with joint ventures from other rising states. And to remind, the domestic markets are part of the larger global markets. They are the Brics of the larger global market. Some endeavors will be successful, others will not. But the accumulated efforts by the striving states of the East will redistribute a larger share of production and value towards themselves. So that includes the overview of the economic tendencies. If anyone has any supporting comments, maybe any criticism or any questions, I will be glad to respond and learn as well. We'll see if there are any questions in chat. So far, nothing. All right. Well, I will then resume with the next section. The next section has to do with certainly a similar trend, but it is in the sphere of geopolitics and military. This could be put under the rubric of geopolitical independence, nuclear weapons, and domestic arms manufacturing. So, as an analogy, as a historical analogy, in the 18th and 19th centuries, the middle and lower classes in Europe struggled to promote and secure their rights. In retrospect, the resistance of the elites and the royalty to this trend was tantamount to opposing the movement of history, as futile as today's efforts to prevent maturation and independence of teens and young adults. You can't tell them, in other words, to stop getting more adult and becoming older, to stop growing. It's against nature. So, the same with Western efforts to prevent nuclear proliferation and geopolitical independence on the part of the striving states of the East. China, for example, exploded its first nuclear device in 1964, India in 1974, Pakistan in 1998, Northern Korea, in 2006. So the club is growing. Will it stop? Is it? Or will we see Iran, and certainly, if Iran, then Turkey? All of these states also possess and work to advance their missile technologies. Iran has, for example, developed a wide spectrum of credible ballistic and cruise missiles, as well as those of the air defense, by a combination of copying, clandestine international cooperation with Korea and Russia and China, and also by domestic efforts. Likewise, in the geopolitics of the wider Middle East, a region that probably starts in Western Afghanistan and ends somewhere in Libya, we are seeing the reemergence of Turkey and Iran, in addition to the arrival of Russia, and the slow, right now, but steady rise of Chinese presence. In other words, it's becoming crowded. Turkey's zone of influence has expanded over the last 20 years, if we observe, into northern Iraq after the US invasion, into northern Syria and western Libya after Arab Spring. Ankara has also appeared in the Caucasus recently, and now in the Persian Gulf, notably in aiding Qatar. And one shouldn't be surprised if soon Turkey establishes a prominent role in the Horn of Africa and the Gulf of Aden. So if you look at the map, it's a very wide region, in some ways reminiscent of the broader Ottoman Empire. Moreover, today Turkey is one of the key transit countries for China's massive Belt and Road project, and at the same time, for a number of gas and oil pipelines from Russia and now from Azerbaijan, from the Caucasus. Iran also has seen its presence in Iraq, Yemen, and Syria grow over the past decade, in addition to its existing strong influence in Lebanon and Western Afghanistan. Much like Turkey, Iran is also slated to benefit from China's Belt and Road project. Both states, Turkey and Iran, seem to be reassembling parts of their historic Middle Eastern empires. At the same time, of course, it is to be expected that the striving states of the East will likely clash with each other as they defend and promote their interests. In fact, this geopolitical reawakening is not specifically and exclusively directed against US influence. In fact, it actually offers Washington opportunities to play different sides against each other. Offers Washington a lot of room for diplomacy and geopolitics, specifically. However, objectively or generally, this development does infringe on what used to be European hegemony of the 19th century, and when it was picked up by United States, US-led centrality during the Cold War. And then, once again, US-led Western hegemony after 1990, after 1991. So that hegemony is coming to an end, and it's approximately, give and take, about 200 years old, maybe longer. This is so because a different setting is being established, in this case, in a wider Middle East, for diplomacy and geopolitics. And this setting, perhaps this condition could be called simply multipolarity, a condition where actors pursue their interests without seeking clearance from Washington or from Moscow, as used to be done during the Cold War. And so they make their own agreements. They establish their own cooperative ventures. They take military action on their own, or with allies of their own choosing. For better or for worse, this development reduces the role of Washington to that just of a major power among others. Still a major power, but no longer the indispensable unipole. Now, it is doubtful that this new distribution of power will be more peaceful and safer than the Cold War bipolarity, or the quarter century of US-led unipolarity. In today's broader Middle East, for example, regional powers of Turkey and Iran, and outsiders like United States, Russia, China, and other additional players like France, United Arab Emirates, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt are both clashing and cooperating depending on the place and issue at hand. Neither can one say that the regional actors are likely to live better, in other words, safer and wealthier, more secure. We can't say that during this period of power transition and redistribution of influence. We can't expect this to be a safer, wealthier, more secure time for them. For example, we can see that today in Libya, NATO member France, along with the United Arab Emirates and Egypt, have almost come to actual blows with NATO member Turkey and its ally Qatar, or Qatar, rather. In Syria, Russia and Iran, their partnership, have experienced tensions with Turkey and with the US, while US and Turkey themselves saw a rise in tensions over Kurdish presence in northern Syria. Meanwhile, in contrast to that tension between Turkey and United States, Turkey and Iran have quietly cooperated in northern Iraq over the issue of Kurdish independence. They both jointly crushed Kurdish efforts to become separate in the north. Turkey and Egypt have seen a noticeable cooling of their relations since the fall of Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And now they have added disagreements over Libya's future, which led to military flexing by both sides. Even though Turkey has seen several spats with the United States, at the same time, Ankara still supported President Trump's missile strikes in 2017 and then 2018 on Syria. All the while, Turkey is working out various modes of cooperation with Russia in Syria, while supporting Washington's strikes in Syria and cooperating with Iran in northern Iraq. In their turn, Russia and Turkey have established joint patrols in the north of Syria. They have jointly implemented Turkish Stream gas pipeline project. They concluded the sale of Russian S-400 air defense systems, and they began constructing a giant nuclear power plant in Turkey worth about $25 billion, the Akku nuclear power plant. At the same time, both Russia and Turkey have experienced tensions over events in Syria and in the Caucasus. In the three cases of hostile alignments in the Middle East that appear to be somewhat permanent, and these three cases are United States and Iran, United States and China, and United States and Russia, these three more or less permanent hostile alignments, NATO member Turkey approaches relations with both sides, with US and Iran, with US and China, and with US and Russia, as not better or worse than with the others. In other words, United States in this case appears as an important partner, but certainly not especially better or qualitatively more ethical than any others. And this is, of course, an anathema for the Atlanticist ideology, which sees the United States as an indispensable and historically and morally essentially different power than Iran, China, or Russia. Therefore, today asking whose side is Turkey on, or for that matter, whose side Russia or Iran or China are on, makes little sense in the post-Cold War world and in the post-unipolar Middle East, because issues have proliferated and power has diffused. In fact, it seems that right now is that special time, first time since 16th and 17th centuries, that regional Middle Eastern dynamics have been driven as much by local powers and their client groups as by the Europeans. We see, first and foremost, Turkey and Iran driving, and to some extent Saudi Arabia, but first and foremost Turkey and Iran, driving some of the regional power dynamics. We haven't seen that since 16th and 17th centuries. It is the first time ever, in fact, that all of the actors, Western states, Turkey and Iran, and Russia, have been involved in the Middle East as independent players. It's the first time that it has been so crowded. And mind you that neither China nor India have yet expanded their geopolitical influence into the region. And now a weakening of NATO unity is developing before our very eyes. No longer facing the Soviet challenge that helped maintain the coherence of the alliance under Washington's leadership, key NATO states have now moved to pursue their own political and economic agendas, sometimes in direct conflict with each other. As mentioned earlier, Turkey and France are now on opposing sides in Libya. And France has just indicated political military support for Greece, another NATO member, in Greek seabed dispute with Turkey about the natural resources of gas and oil in Eastern Mediterranean. Turkey, in its turn, bought Russian air defense systems that are designed to do what? First and foremost, strike and deter NATO jets. And Turkey has partnered with Moscow on 3 gas pipelines bypassing Ukraine. Furthermore, Turkey has started energy prospecting in Eastern Mediterranean in spite of opposition from European Union and in spite of European Union sanctions. Turkey has also occasionally bandwagoned with Iran, as I mentioned, against US-sponsored Kurds. In 2003, don't forget, Ankara refused to allow its territory to be used for the US invasion of Iraq. It later continued to buy energy from Iran in spite of the sanctions. NATO member Germany, in its turn, another NATO member, but how disciplined is it? Well, it has increased gas cooperation, natural gas cooperation with Russia, expanded it in a post-Cold War world. It has also, Germany, greatly expanded trade with China. And in both cases, it has earned Washington's displeasure, as been recently aired over the last several years by President Trump. Both Germany and Turkey have now come under direct US pressure, even threats of sanctions over their cooperation with Moscow. And Washington has also threatened its NATO allies with sanctions if they expand trade with Iran. So in a specific case of Germany, which along with Turkey is one of the most important members of NATO, Germany is being pressed by Washington to limit on at least roll back lucrative cooperation, economic cooperation with China and Russia, and to forego export contracts with Iran. And this is at a time when President Trump has repeatedly complained of the unfair balance of trade between Germany and the United States. As states like Venezuela, Iran, and others, Russia too, come under American sanctions, the rise of China is helping reshape the distribution of power across the world, not only directly by creating another superpower, but also indirectly by abetting and aiding states in need. In short, China's rise creates options and space for maneuver for these countries. China's growing oil and gas consumption has enabled independent actors like Russia, like Iran, as well as Venezuela, to reorient part of their energy exports towards East Asia. This simple fact has geopolitical implications as well, because it gives these states options they did not possess 30 years ago. Russian and Chinese support for President Maduro in Venezuela has helped him survive Washington's economic and political pressures, might even say attacks. Moreover, besides trading and buying Venezuelan oil, Russia and China have sent military advisors there, while China has been building a number of factories in Venezuela. In its turn, Iran continues to skirt US sanctions and export oil to China. It has also worked with Russia in the oil for goods scheme, barter scheme. Moscow's arrival in Syria was in partnership with Iran and Iranian Hezbollah. It helped turn the tide of war in Syria. So if Russia follows today its recent sales of air defense systems to Iran with a wider spectrum of arms, this will further affect the political military balance in the region. Additionally, the Russia-led Eurasian Union has signed a free trade agreement with Iran, while Iran, in its turn, has signed a number of large trade and investment agreements with China. So the synergy from cooperation between Russia, China, and Iran will be among the key forces in Eurasian geopolitics, with reverberations across the whole continent. Moscow, too, has benefited from China's rise. Thanks to China's growing appetite for energy, Russia has undertaken a number of massive projects directed towards East Asia and has now diversified away from what used to be exclusive reliance on European NATO energy markets. Through several oil, gas pipelines, as well as projects in liquefied natural gas, and the giant Power of Siberia 1 and 2 gas pipelines, Moscow is increasing both its policy space, its options, and more immediately, its revenues, its export revenues. China has now surpassed Germany, mind you, as Russia's largest trade partner. It used to be Germany, but now it's China. And Russo-Chinese trade is now approximately twice the size of Russo-German trade. Beijing's Belt and Road project has seen increased number of containers shipped through Russia towards Europe and vice versa. And Moscow is betting its massive Arctic shipping project on China's growing role in the world economy. So Moscow is hitching its wagon to Chinese train, as do other countries. It is also linking its first high-speed rail program to the giant Eurasia Transit Project, which aims to connect China with the European Union through Russia, in part, of course, with large Chinese lending and investments to pool such a massive project. So in its turn, thanks to partnership with Russia over the past 30 years, China has also enjoyed certain benefits. First, it has enjoyed a quiescent, a quiet strategic rear, a reality that is likely to endure at least for the medium term, as China's standoff with the US intensifies. Furthermore, energy imports from Russia help China bypass vulnerable sea lanes of the Middle East, Indian Ocean, and Southeast Asia. Moscow has continued to sell advanced weapon systems to China. Chinese purchases of Russian weapons helped save Russia's defense industry during the collapse of the 1990s. And today they provide Moscow with much needed revenues. They also aid Chinese military modernization. China has also bought civilian nuclear power plants from Russia, granted access to growing Russian agricultural and food exports at a time of Western sanctions on Moscow. In its turn, Beijing has helped supply Russia with important equipment denied to it after Western sanctions, including in the sphere of microchips and electronics. And China has actually opened a number of automobile plants and household appliance factories in Russia. The two have set up and maintained a growing international organization, the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization for Central Asia. And they have jointly made efforts to squeeze American military presence out of Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan. They have set up the Brics, BRICS, Development Bank, and have expanded the use of national currencies in their mutual trade, bypassing the dollar. Moreover, their sovereign international payment systems, although small in comparison to the Western SWIFT, SWIFT, though they're small comparison to Western SWIFT, nevertheless, they enable interested states that come under harsh American sanctions and that are excluded from the dollar system to continue to trade and to survive. It allows them breathing space and room for maneuver. So that concludes our second section. The next one will address liberal ideology or decline of liberal ideology. I want to see if there are any questions or comments, and maybe folks need a little break. No questions for now, all right? So far my opinions have been unchallenged, and this is how I like it, by the way. So the next section, it's going to be a little shorter, and it addresses decline of liberal ideology. So as in the economic and geopolitical spheres, which we just mentioned, where multipolarity has now taken shape, in the sphere of Western ideology, ideology of liberalism, the West has been losing some adherents, not only in the rest of the world, but actually in the West itself, in the epicenter of the Euro-Atlantic community. For the non-Western world, this represents the second act in the decline of the European globalist, secular, and progress-oriented ideologies, which came to the fore in the 19th century: liberalism and Marxist socialism. The first act, in other words, was the decline of the appeal of socialism during the 1980s, and of course the collapse of Soviet-style socialism, which was the Soviet Union was the main promoter of this version of socialism. So that Western ideology collapsed, and we are now seeing a gradual decline of another Western ideology, secular, progress-oriented, globalist ideology, liberalism, its cousin. In its heyday during the Cold War and after, Western liberalism did not penetrate older, non-Western cultures deep enough to become a well-rooted force. As Samuel Huntington predicted in 1993, with the end of the Cold War, older traditional cultures will reemerge, both in the form of nationalism and of the higher, wider civilizational identity. Furthermore, Huntington argued that the very notion that there could be a universal civilization is a Western idea, directly at odds with the particularism of most Asian societies. In other words, outside of its home base in the Euro-Atlantic community, liberalism will have less acceptance. This argument from Huntington was part of his reply to Francis Fukuyama's end of history thesis. As an example, we can see today Turkey, which after a century of deliberate efforts to transform itself into a more secular and even westernized society, which it has in many ways succeeded in doing, right now is beginning in some ways to revert back to its older cultural and historic roots in the revival of Islam as a political force and the the so-called Neo-Osmanism. Similarly, if we look at the former Soviet Union, Communist Party spent approximately 70 years trying to teach, to inculcate secular, socialist, internationalist ideology into its population. After 1945, Soviet Union spent over a generation trying to do the same for East and Central European societies. And yet, what do we see today? Soviet states, post-Soviet states, including even members of the European Union, are some of the most nationalist in Europe. In fact, even Poland and Hungary, Catholic Poland and Hungary, historically much more Western than Eastern, are showing their limits in adapting and adopting cultural and political liberalism of Western Europe. They have opposed European Union's directives on migrant policy, and in the sphere of LGBTQ, and in the sphere of judicial independence. Soviet socialist internationalism failed in these Eastern European states. Okay, well, it remains to be seen if Western liberalism will succeed on the same soil. Certainly, one might have assumed this in 1990s, during the epoch of triumph, the period of triumph. And indeed, this was attempted in the economic and cultural sphere. However, today, when parades and marches of LGBTQ activists in Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine are radically opposed by the great majority of the population and by the Orthodox churches, which have come along with nationalism to substitute, to take up space where there used to be Soviet ideology. When such LGBTQ marches do take place, they are generally imposed by authorities from the capital, who are acting at the behest of European Union officials. A way to testify, it's their way to testify to their country's liberal commitment and their path to eventual EU membership, and more immediately to receive tangible European Union subsidies. The population of these societies views European Union as a place to find work, and for the fortunate minority, as a destination for leisure and a source of prestigious imported goods. For the local elites, European Union promises solutions to domestic social problems. In other words, local unemployed go to Western Europe and send money home, while European Union will send subsidies to new members and turn them into tourist destinations with well-paved roads. In other words, for the new and potential members from Eastern Europe, the commitment to European Union, in my opinion, is not so much ideological and philosophical, in other words, for liberalism, but rather much more material and tangible. Yet, even if these societies and elites eventually succeeded in imposing Western liberal ideology and culture upon themselves, if they successfully did that, it would still be a limited advance for liberalism in terms of geography and numbers, demography, and economy, in the context of greater global decline of liberalism. In fact, the eastern regions of Europe have always been a zone of ebb and flow between the larger Western and Eastern Christian civilizations. In the same way, they have been the zone of ebb and flow between the secular ones of liberalism and socialism. Many societies in this zone are European, have always been European, but not especially Western, or only partially Western. So their accession to the West today, to liberalism today, if it does happen, would represent only an incremental advance in the context of general erosion of Western economic, ideological, and military voice. More importantly, the erosion of the Euro-Atlantic community's dominant role in the world economy, in the tangible sphere, has affected the popularity of neoliberalism in the West itself, in my opinion. Simply put, ideological triumphalism and convictions, they work best when material well-being is advancing. The voting public will be noticeably less faithful to and trusting in proclamations and slogans and doctrine when the public is constantly vexed and troubled by ominous economic forces, rising inequality, and difficulties of multiculturalism, difficulties of advanced multiculturalism. These are all taking place today as part of the agglomerated processes of globalization. Historically, we saw how in the 1930s, Weimar Germany, the largest democracy in Europe, was devastated by global capitalist crisis and by liberal cultural practices at home. It soon lost its liberal democratic character, turning into Nazi Germany. Prior to that, Italy, Portugal, Poland, and Hungary, what today among the key members of the European Union, have already gone a right-wing dictatorship. Later, during the 1930s worldwide depression, Romania, Spain, Greece, Austria all switched from democracies, from troubled democracies, to right-wing dictatorial regimes, as to some extent did Japan. So currently, the socioeconomic anxiety, even in the United States, has expressed itself in various ways. In the realm of politics, we have seen firsthand growing radicalization of discourse and the rise of much more pronounced right-wing and left-wing candidates and discourse. The language in social media and in the news has lost a fair amount of courtesy and tolerance for opposing views, especially if you go on YouTube and try to compare similar discourse, presidential debates, and news debates of the 1960s and 70s. They were much more polite and courteous and less radical. Yet there are other indicators, specifically in the socioeconomic sphere and also in the ideological sphere, of the malaise that is currently present in the US. For example, some unpleasant numbers, deaths from opioid overdoses, which is known right now as the opioid epidemic, including from the prescribed and synthetic and also from actual heroin, have risen 5 times between 1999 and 2017. So in the 18-year period, they have risen 5 times. During the same period, suicide rates in the US have increased by 33%. Income inequality, as measured by the Gini index, has grown as well. Hourly wages have been rising, but they have been outpaced by the rising cost of tuition, hospital services, and some of the housing as well. So college tuition costs, for example, have risen by 4 times during this period, between 1990 and 2020. So in a 30-year period, they have risen by a factor of 4. Hospital services have risen more than 3 times. Hourly wages have risen by 130%, so 2.3 times. So they have risen, but they have not kept pace. The ratio of home prices to median income has risen by 2.87 times. They've risen from 2.87 early in 2000 to over 4 in early 2020. So they almost doubled in 20 years. In other words, some of the most important elements of the good life have steadily been becoming less affordable, shall we say. Medicare, college education, and housing. Little wonder that the ratio of household debt as a share of disposable income has risen from 70% in the year 2000 to 87% in 2018. So in 18 years, the ratio of household debt as a percentage of disposable income of families have gone from 70% to 87%. However, on the positive side, this debt burden has become lighter. Why? Debt servicing payments today take a smaller share of annual household income. They are under 10%, whereas 20 years ago, they were 12.5%. How has this been achieved? It's been achieved through US Federal Reserve drastically lowering interest rates during this long recession. In the United States and European Union, the historically low interest rates and the massive monetary emissions are now the norm, and they are an essential factor in sustainable debt servicing for the population and corporations, and in boosting consumer spending, and in achieving some sort of economic growth, a modicum of economic growth. But what has this led to? To help fund this liquidity and the growing bill for social welfare programs, plus the growing military costs for the US. US federal debt has risen from 55% of the GDP 20 years ago to over 107 in early 2020, before the coronavirus. So in 20 years, it has gone from 55% of the GDP to 107. And so quickly with the conclusion, as the historical shift, a rebalancing between the West and the East takes place, leading regional and global actors will in some ways be disoriented. In early 2020, for example, 36% of United States adults aged 18 to 29 thought that other countries are better than the United States. Only 15% thought the United States stands above other countries in the world. In their turn, geopolitically, the striving states of the East could fall prey to their own premature activism if they are overtaken by domestic nationalist agitation for assertive foreign policy, if they become stuck in the whirlpool in countries and zones previously taken up by US presence or by seemingly stable regimes. Instead, in my opinion, the rising states of the East, they ought to form condominiums to jointly manage conflicting claims and ambitions and facilitate accommodation. Ideologically, however, they and a part of their intelligentsia are likely to get rid of orientation on the Western liberal model. They are likely to find new and to re-examine old ideas, to develop pragmatic, not ideological, but pragmatic ad hoc approaches, as well as to learn from observing other countries and societies. The American city upon a hill will still serve as one of the models and possibilities, and will still attract many across the world. In the sphere of the economy, the leading states will be gradually forced, I think, to form their own blocks and regional customs and free trade zones. Step away from unabashed globalization in order to better protect their domestic markets as competition intensifies. Thanks to the historical change and to the rise of the thriving states of the East, globalization of the Euro-Atlantic community will now give way to multiple nodes and constellations. So in other words, it will be truly global because it will include input from the Middle East, Eurasia, South Asia, and East Asia on equal terms rather than being driven by the West. Okay, so I thank you for your patience and endurance. I know it took over an hour. I was hoping that it take a little less. And If anyone has any comments or questions, I will gladly field them.
We do have a question.
All right. All right. Here's one. One-party governments have rarely survived longer than 70 years. However, China seems to be moving ahead with strength. That's a good observation. Can this be accredited to advancements in technology, manufacturing, or another factor? Well, that is certainly insightful observation. I might have to say, to add North Korea, Vietnam, and we might even say eventually Cambodia to this list as time moves forward. Yes, Cambodia has now a multi-party system, but the former Communist Party, I think it's been renamed now, I forget the exact term, is maintaining massive presence. It usually wins well over 50%. So this Chinese model that you allude to is fairly attractive because Vietnam, Laos, and soon, I believe, gradually already taking place, North Korea will adopt this one-party system along with state-managed enterprises and small zones of capitalism. Why has this been successful? Interestingly, should I resort to cultural argument, most of these successful economic transitions within the one-party model have been taking place in East Asia and nowhere else, ultimately. So it might be cultural. It also might be explained by success. Chinese government, the Chinese state have, I think, transitioned to development, to the ideology of development, reduction of poverty, growing wealth as one of the main lodestars of their legitimacy. As long as they are doing this successfully, transforming the country, as long as they are offering channels for energies of their people, as long as they have a growing number of millionaires and billionaires, they might be able to pursue this policy for the foreseeable future. I'm not going to say indefinitely, but for the foreseeable future. But I certainly have to agree that this question sheds important light on the success of East Asia. The hope that China, as it becomes more middle class and wealthier, more developed, will therefore become more democratic, at least in its political system, so far has not been borne out. But I cannot quite say it's because I don't know enough. So I cannot assume that a multi-party democracy is the most urgent, the most dear wish of the majority of the Chinese population. It might appear from our perspective or from some of the activists in Hong Kong that democracy is the most urgent and immediate concern, or should be the most urgent and immediate concern for the Chinese. But some might say that it's actually developing the country, reducing poverty, ascending to its historical destiny, and improving the life of people, not necessarily developing a multi-party system. Certainly, its one-party regime has proven very successful over the last 40 years. And it has survived millions and millions of Chinese going abroad, going to Northeastern, going to United States, going to Europe, where they can read and listen to Western news and narratives about China, then go back home and continue to pursue their activities without destabilizing Chinese regime. In part, certainly, it's to advances in technology in surveillance that are utilized not just by China, but by Western democracies as well, but certainly very successfully and effectively by China. But in other part, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that the Chinese Communist Party, even though it's a one-party regime, it is in some ways a certain vacuum that sucks up a large number of active, ambitious Chinese into the power structure. It's not a closed off, exclusive organization. It's, millions and millions strong, and it allows a certain venue for ambitious individuals. And so it's not a closed off system. But these items, these factors, it's surveillance technology, it's economic success, which utilizes and captures energies of its population, and it's a large Communist Party, which sucks up a large number of active individuals. These three, I believe, help China maintain, certain political coherence. We call it dictatorship. Others might see it somewhat different. All right. So hopefully this my reply somewhat satisfies you, but I enjoyed your question more than I enjoyed my reply. Let's just say that. Yes. Okay. What is my view on U.S. re-entering the nuclear deal with Iran, as President-elect Joe Biden announced? Yes. Well, we all are, whether we enjoy it or not, depending how we voted, have looked at this election as very pivotal. Many in Western Europe have seen the Trump phenomena as temporary. Just let us hang on, let us survive these 4 years, and then things will be back to normal. Let's just say this, that very harsh, almost suffocating financial and economic sanctions were put on Iran under President Obama when Joe Biden was vice president, and Hillary Clinton for a while was Secretary of State. The momentum for harsh sanctions against Iran, the logic of harsh sanctions against Iran, was not just stemming from Trump, even though the United States is the most important actor in such a scenario, but it was also stemming from Israel, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates. More indirectly, not as forthcoming and open, but more indirectly. Neither Turkey, nor Russia, nor leading European states are interested in Iran acquiring nuclear weapons. The nuclear deal certainly was a way to reincorporate Iran as a, so to speak, a legitimate and acceptable geopolitical actor, without it acquiring nuclear weapons. Because Iranian acquisition of nuclear weapons is simply a first step in Turkey and Saudi Arabia acquiring nuclear weapons as well. This domino is already pregnant, right? The next domino has been trying to fall for a while, with India, Pakistan, and North Korea acquiring nuclear weapons. So the tendency is for this poor analogy, for this wildfire to continue into Iran, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. Certainly the nuclear deal with Iran, as John Mersheimer, famous realist scholar, has stated, is in America's interest. And I welcome you guys to read that article. It's a very short article, maybe half a page. It's an op-ed piece by John Mersheimer. It's called U.S.-Iranian nuclear deal is in America's interest. And I think it's not just John Mersheimer, it's, I think, written by a number of leading realists. They signed it. They say that it keeps Iran from going nuclear. One, it legitimizes future economic, financial, and political sanctions on Iran if Iran actually leaves the nuclear the nuclear agreement, because then you will have truly international United Nations sanctions where both Europe and Russia and China and Turkey and others will be on board. Whereas right now, this US sanctions, even though US is the superpower and the most influential state in the world, it's still, these sanctions are rather unilateral. It's mostly US with Israel in the background and Saudi Arabia, and the rest of the countries are falling in line like the European Union because of fear and because of a strong US presence in the economic sphere in the European Union. But others, like China and Russia, and to some extent Turkey and India, are continuing to trade with Iran in oil, gas, and manufactured items. So withdrawing from the Iranian nuclear deal does not impose suffocating sanctions on Iran because other countries are not buying into them, notably regional powers and Eurasian powers, one. And Iran has gradually been increasing its nuclear program because the United States withdrew from sanctions. So we're not getting either. We're not getting, or rather United States and Israel, they're not getting suffocating sanctions on Iran, and we're not getting Iranian compliance because US and Israel have withdrawn. The problem here, though, for Israel and for Saudi Arabia is that Iran can be very influential and grow economically and geopolitically without nuclear weapons. It can be a growing economy, a power with growing influence across the Middle East, and with ballistic and cruise missile programs. Moreover, able to buy Russian, Chinese, and perhaps even European weapons because sanctions have been lifted because it's complying with a nuclear deal. So without nuclear weapons, Iran can increase its geopolitical sphere and influence and develop its missile program. For Israel, for Saudi Arabia, for US, the goal is not so much, I think, or at least for Trump and his team, not so much to stop Iranian nuclear program, that's just one subfield, but to stop Iran from becoming a major regional player. And I think the Iranian nuclear deal allows that to happen because Iran can be a regional power, as can Turkey, without acquiring nuclear weapons. So it's a difficult situation. You cannot have a perfect solution in international relations short of a totally victorious war with subsequent occupation. I'm specifically referring to Germany after World War II. Not after World War I, but after World War II. To Japan after World War II. So that type of solution, total victory by both sides, by Soviet Union and United States, and then subsequent occupation. Otherwise, you're just going to have various suboptimal arrangements. One is trying to suffocate Iran by unilateral US sanctions. The other one, allowing Iran to develop and to boost its influence, but without nuclear weapons. None of them are perfect. All right. Are sanctions no longer useful? How about this? Sanctions, even though the world is becoming more multipolar, sanctions from US, even when they are unilateral, when, let's say, neither Russia nor China nor European Union are on board, at least diplomatically. The recent American sanctions on Iran have shown how much influence the United States still has. Now, diplomatically, in the United Nations Security Council and in the General Assembly, US unilateral sanctions, or in other words, US, Israeli, Saudi lobbying for sanctions, but in this case it's ultimately US, have not received diplomatic support. These countries, members of the United Nations Security Council, have rejected US one-sided sanctions. That's diplomatically. But indeed, in fact, the European countries have complied, because major European corporations who are present on the US market are put in front of a very clear choice by Trump and Mike Pompeo. You could gain a market in Iran and in return lose a market share or all of the market in the United States. Which one do you choose? United States being the largest importer, the largest, to put it poorly, I'm not going to use maybe the most appropriate term, the largest dumping ground for other countries' exports, whether it's European Union or China or Mexico for that matter, gives America a certain leverage. Airbus, Mercedes, various German and French pharmaceuticals and technology and electronic companies and consumer companies, when faced with the prospect of gaining something in Iran after the UN sanctions end, but in the process losing something in the United States, are going to choose the United States because they operate globally and they operate in the United States and they operate through the global dollar system. And if all of these are, or at least some of these are denied to these companies, they will incur heavy losses. So sanctions are useful when they are done by United States. Think about it this way. United States economic share in the world today is smaller than it was 100 years ago. 100 years ago, 1920, United States made up conservatively a third, by other estimates, 40% of world manufacturing, of world economy. Today, US makes up at best about 20%. If we look at purchasing power parity, then it makes less than 20%. So is American influence on the global economy less today than it was 100 years ago? Because its GDP share is smaller. But its influence on world economy is larger because of the international role of the dollar, because of the international role of US clearing houses for dollar transactions, because of the huge role that US market plays for Chinese, for European companies, because of the very odd, might even say ridiculous, but still real fact that when Russian companies in Russia are making a transaction with each other using the dollars, their transactions go through the SWIFT system, I forget, either in Belgium or Luxembourg, and also through various centers in the US. So for a company in Moscow and St. Petersburg, sometimes to make a dollar transaction, their transactions go through European and American centers, and funds there could be frozen. So that's greater influence, that's greater impact that the United States had 100 years ago, even though 100 years ago, the United States had a larger economy. So sanctions are still useful, I believe. They have done damage to Iran. They have done damage to Venezuela. If it's a larger economy, like Russia, US sanctions have not done much. But European sanctions have done more. But the thing is, just like in a boxing match or a wrestling match, international geopolitical struggle have always been full of sweat, black and blue marks, injuries, but that has not deterred countries. Turkey has been put under various economic sanctions. Turkey's lira has taken a hit. Iran has been put under even more suffocating sanctions. But what have we seen in regards to Iran? It has been hurt, but over the last 20 years, its influence in the region has expanded. How has it done so? That's maybe an interesting subject. Russian influence, for example, in the Middle East, has expanded over the last 5-6 years, in spite of Western sanctions. Venezuela has been severely hurt when its oil exports have been pushed out from the dollar system. Sanctions have been impactful, but have they been fully effective? So that's a question. They have made a major dent to Venezuelan economy and finances. Have they reached their goal to overthrow part of the Venezuelan establishment, which also has popular support? Let's not kid ourselves. President Maduro and the Chavists have popular support in Venezuela, even though many of them are unpopular, but they also have popular support. Have they been effective? Have they created regime overthrow in Venezuela? No. But have they been impactful? Yes. But Venezuela has turned to China, to Russia, to India. Russia doesn't need to import Venezuelan oil, but Russian companies buy up Venezuelan oil and they operate in Venezuela and they resell it across Europe. Turkey has been receiving Venezuelan oil and gold, and Turkey has made strong diplomatic moves, both visiting Venezuela and Venezuelan representatives, including, I think, President Maduro, visiting Turkey. So sanctions in a world where there is economic superpower of China, where there's a rising India, where there is a recovered Russia, where there is more independent Turkey, and the European Union that is no longer scared off by a massive Soviet military, and European Union that has increasing interest in the East, which it did not have 40 years ago in China or in India or in Russia. Now they have increasing economic interests in the East. In this situation, in this context, sanctions are less effective. They can still hurt, but they're less effective. Imagine sanctions on Venezuela 40 years ago. Who would buy Venezuelan oil? There's no China or Indian appetite for Venezuelan oil. There are no Russian capitalist, oligarchic, semi-state companies like Rosneft and Gazprom to serve as go-betweens between Venezuela and other countries. The West is the only show in capitalist town 40 years ago and in early 1990s. Now, though, the West is not the only show in town. And because of that, sanctions might still be very hurtful, but I don't know how effective. Your question, whether they are useful, that's somewhere in between, I guess. I don't think they are as effective as they used to be. You might even say they're not effective, but they certainly are still hurtful. If you hurt, but you do not kill Iran or Russia or Turkey, what do you create? Yes.
I think we ran a great time over time, but your presentation was really, really interesting. Myself really enjoyed that, and I hope everyone else enjoyed that as well. If anyone has any questions, you can send it to me, and I'll probably address it to Leon. I know Leon has published some articles, and I can send you the articles if you're interested. Anyway, reach out to me. My email is on a chat, so you can save it for yourself. So that's it. And well, thank you so